Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to give an overview of the state of agriculture and biodiversity and to present some of the work of FAO and its Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture in the field of agriculture and biodiversity. So the agriculture sector, including crops, livestock, forestry, fisheries, and aquaculture, is a major industry employing over 1 billion people. That is 1 in 3 people of the world's economically active labor force. And for the 70% of the world's poor living in rural area, agriculture is the main source of income and employment. As we know, the major challenge of agriculture today and in the future is to feed a growing population with less resources in the context of climate change and while reducing its negative impact on biodiversity and on the environment. Indeed, food production and agriculture, and in particular unsustainable agricultural practices, are the causes of substantial biodiversity loss and environmental degradation, namely through land use change, conversion of natural lands into agricultural land, encroachment, fragmentation, introduction of exotic species, etc. Yet, at the same time, biodiversity is fundamental to the agriculture sector, which directly depends on the diversity of crop, livestock, aquatic organisms, forestries, microorganisms, and invertebrates, thousands of species and their genetic variability that support the functions, structure, and processes of production systems. This biodiversity for food and agriculture, or agricultural biodiversity, has been managed or influenced by farmers, fisherfolks, pastoralists, forest dwellers for hundreds of generations and reflect both activities and natural processes. Within biodiversity for food and agriculture, genetic resources are of particular importance as they are the building blocks for a nutrition-sensitive, resistant, adaptable, sustainable, productive, and resilient agriculture. A few examples: sweet potato varieties in East Africa with increased provitamin A contents, varieties of common beans with extreme drought tolerance, high yield and yield stability in Nicaragua, the wide range of breeds that offer a pool of adaptive traits and functional traits, allowing farmers to choose breeds that are most suitable for their production environment and constraints, or the immense genetic diversity that allows for breeding and domestication of wild food trees that can support the increasing demand for food such as tamarind and moringa trees. Just like the overall biodiversity, genetic resources for food and agriculture are also being lost, and because of threats such as climate change, loss of natural habitats, environmental degradation, effects of increasing population pressure, change in consumer demands, and the use of few species, varieties, and breeds, therefore neglecting locally adapted land races, varieties, and breeds, and the reservoir of useful traits they represent. Now, with the aim to ensure the conservation and sustainable use of genetic resources, the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, hosted by FAO, is, with its 178 country members, the only intergovernmental forum to specifically discuss and negotiate matters relevant to all components of biodiversity important for food and agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and aquaculture. And as its cycle of work, the Commission oversees the preparation of global assessment on the state, conservation, and use of genetic resources for food and agriculture in the relevant sectors. So these assessments are country-based, which mean that based on reports prepared by countries, an analysis at the global level is prepared. Between 1998 and 2015, assessments on the state of plant, animal, and forest genetic resources have been released, and currently the assessment of the state of aquatic genetic resources is ongoing and is planned for 2017. As a follow-up to these global assessments, the Commission considers, and not always but very often, agrees on policy responses such as global plans of action, guidelines, code of conducts, and standards. As a next step, countries on a voluntary basis implement the agreed Commission's action plans or other instrument at national level. And finally, bringing the story to a full circle, countries monitor and report back to the Commission on their implementation measures and on the impact these had at the country level. Using and conserving genetic resources is part of the solution. However, addressing the overall biodiversity relevant to food and agriculture in and around production systems is important. And FAO is currently preparing the first global cross-sectoral integrated assessment on the state of the world's biodiversity for food and agriculture, with the objective to document the links that are known between biodiversity for food and agriculture and the delivery of ecosystem services and functions, assess the contributions made by biodiversity to sustainable production, resilience and adaptability, and to the livelihoods and incomes of small-scale producers, to document the extent and use of management practices that enhances conservation and make sustainable use of biodiversity for food and agriculture, such as organic agriculture, agroforestry, etc., and highlight innovations and new approaches for conservation and use. All relevant stakeholders have been and are invited to contribute to this assessment by sharing their experience and knowledge on the state of biodiversity for food and agriculture, either directly to FAO or via the national focal points that have been designated in each country to prepare country reports. And the experience of businesses and the private sector, which can be leader in innovative practices for sustainable intensification, among other, would be particularly welcome. And for your information, the draft report will be presented at the next session of the Commission in January 2017. Now to conclude this overview, I would like to very briefly mention some of the many initiatives of FAO that aim to provide resources and an enabling environment for all relevant stakeholders, be them smallholders, businesses, governments, researchers, breeders, etc., for protecting wild biodiversity through more sustainable agriculture, and at the same time to conserve and use genetic resources for food and agriculture and biodiversity for food and agriculture. For example, there are the Save and Grow guidelines, which provide essential tools for sustainably increasing agricultural production, the International Treaty for the Conservation and Exchange of Plant Genetic Resources, several important resources for climate-smart agriculture, pollination initiatives, agroecology, voluntary guidelines for the integration of genetic resources in national climate change adaptation plans, code of conduct for sustainable fisheries, and the list go on. So with these words, I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you. And you may take your seat. We do have time for a couple of questions from the audience. If there are some, I don't see a hand at the moment, so I'd like to ask myself, you actually showed a slide with the sort of the main threats for the genetic biodiversity. Not knowing the area intimately, I'd like to sort of ask, what does the research show about the resilience of certain organisms? I mean, the climate is changing and the habitats are changing. Are there some trends about certain types of organisms that can be resilient and survive, and others, groups of others that are sort of threatened? Can you elaborate on that with a few words?
Thank you for this question. Indeed, this is the beauty of variability, is that all species and all varieties, breeds, and even within varieties and breeds, the organisms tend to adapt to local conditions, so and to change also. And it's the genetic variability that allows for this adaptation. So depending on the context, there is indeed adapted species for almost any type of environmental context. I hope this answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Another question from the audience? No. Okay, then I suggest we move on to our next speaker.